that culture isn't just something that happens to you, you happen to it.
I'm Dr. Joey Fawcett, host of the Work Positive Podcast, here to help you do one thing today that creates a positive work culture so you grow people and profits. Hey, do you ever wonder what the secret culture code is for peak performance? Then you'll love this episode of the Work Positive Podcast because we're going to unlock that culture code with the author of Actualized Teamwork, Unlocking the Culture Code for Optimal Performance. He serves as the Dennis Thompson Distinguished Chair and Professor of Leadership at the McCall School of Business at Queen's University of Charlotte, North Carolina. He also serves as the Director of the Office of Leadership Initiatives. So get ready to receive your secret culture decoder ring and unlock optimal performance for your teams on this episode of the Work Positive Podcast. Work Positive Nation, I am excited to introduce you to my new best friend, Dr. Will Sparks. Dr. Will, welcome to the Work Positive Podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Oh, I'm delighted to be with you. Absolutely delighted. Man, I'm looking for a secret decoder ring to unlock the culture code. Have you got one in your pocket you could slip on my finger?
I've spent the better part of 30 years researching culture from a very applied perspective, not looking at it from a theoretical lens necessarily, but trying to understand how can we work together more effectively in teams. And so I have developed a code, if you will, the sort of a benchmark score that predicts optimal performance and engagement, and also predicts when you're going to have disengagement and low performance as well.
Oh, I absolutely love it. So the decoder ring is here in this episode of the Work Positive Podcast. I absolutely love it. What got you interested? You say you've been doing research for 30 years, which is fascinating. So we've got longitudinal data here. What got you interested in unlocking the culture code for optimal performance?
When I discovered the field of organizational psychology, I was a psychology and philosophy and religion double major in undergrad, and I knew I didn't want to go the sort of counseling and therapy route. I wanted to be a psychologist, but I wanted to work in applied settings. And I found organizational psychology, did my master's at Appalachian State, and then went to George Washington University in their organizational behavior and development, which is essentially org psych, in the business school. And my advisor, the late Dr. Jerry Harvey, who is world famous for the Abilene paradox and the sort of mismanaged agreement. I studied under Dr. Harvey. I have a TED Talk that is essentially a tribute to Dr. Harvey. And that was of course, his expertise is in providing a psychodynamic perspective, which is an awareness for and an appreciation of the unconscious at a group level, the impact they have on the emotional dynamics and ultimately the performance of a team. And so that was started me on my journey back in 1994 with App, and started in 96 with Dr. Harvey and GW.
Oh, wow. I remember the first time I watched that little video about the Abilene paradox. It was fascinating to me. By the way, I always want ice cream. So I'm in for ice cream. Anybody ever say, I don't care what flavor, just take me to get ice cream.
I'm right there with you.
Yeah. So how did you, I'm sure you did some fascinating work in your doctoral study. What was your project really focused around in terms of org psych and unlocking this culture code?
Yeah, it was in creating an assessment that would measure the culture, the underlying emotional dynamics of teams or any group in an applied setting. And so it was based on the work of Wilfred Bion, and many of your listeners may not know that name, but they probably know the person he influenced tremendously was Bruce Tuckman, who came up with storming. And so he's got that.
Exactly, that four-stage process. I learned that at NC State when I was doing my doctoral work in adult ed.
Forming, storming, norming, and performing. And so the challenge with that, though, is that it was based on a developmental model of personality, individual personality development, which does occur in sort of sequential stages. There's actually very little, if any, evidence to suggest that teams develop in a linear sequential stage. So the categories match, but to think that you have to go through forming and then storming before you can get to performing, the data doesn't support that. So I was
Hmm.
really heavily influenced by Dr. Harvey. Dr. John Lobitz was my dear advocate and friend, and
Hmm.
then the late Dr. Eric Winslow. So they had a tremendous influence on me. So I designed, developed, and validated an assessment to measure the underlying culture of a team. And what I've done over the years is then be able to correlate the level of engagement and level of performance based on the category or culture, if you will, of the team.
Wow. Tell us more about what you discovered then. What are those underlying keys?
Yeah, so there are essentially in every group, there are two groups operating. There's the formal conscious group that's focused on the task. So, what's the deliverable and by when?
Hmm.
But underneath that, again, this is providing sort of a psychodynamic, and I'm a big fan of the Swiss psychologist Carl Jung. So it's really sort of
Hmm.
a
Me too.
Jungian sense of what's the underlying shadow, if you will, of a team.
Hmm. Hmm.
And those occur at a emotional level. There are three levels of that, which is detached, dramatic, or dependent. And my research would show that the dependent culture is the most common in corporate America. So it's a follow the leader, the boss is in charge. You don't challenge, you sort of keep your head down and don't ask a
Hmm.
lot of questions. And
Yeah.
and so you typically see that more frequently. But those are the three levels of culture: detached, dramatic, and dependent. And what my research has been able to do is say if your score is within this range, you're going to perform at a higher level. So it measures the level of from 1 to 100 of each of those three emotional dynamics. But then it also measures the level of the formal, conscious, rational, what I call the dynamic scale. And so you put all of that together, and it's a short assessment. It's only 25 questions. It's
Oh,
completely
wow.
validated. My book is published by the Society for Human Resource Management, SHRM. So they went through it with a fine-tooth comb, checked the validity and the veracity of the science behind it. And in
Hmm.
a pretty quick, short online survey, a team can quickly assess if they are dynamic, which is the preferred state, or are they detached? Dramatic is when you're likely to go to Abilene. A dramatic culture is when you're warm and friendly on the surface, but there's trouble brewing beneath that. And that's when groups agree to do something that no one really wants to do.
Yeah.
And then the dependent is the most common. There's an underlying emotionality of fear and anxiety. It's more follow the leader. And of course,
Hmm.
you can't have a dependent culture without a pro-dependent leader. And so
Yes.
a leader that says go fix them, if I'm consulting with that, I said, well, we have to start with you. And sometimes that's a very uncomfortable conversation because you can't have a codependent without a pro-dependent. And so it's
Yeah.
breaking that cycle that is very common and sort of hard to get your hands on. But when you see it in black and white, it becomes much easier to acknowledge and then to manage.
Unless you're so stuck in the command and control model that you deny reality and say, well, that's not my problem. Now, what we're discovering is, and I'm sure you're experiencing this in your consulting practice, which, by the way, Work Positive Nation, you can go to Dr. Will Sparks, that's drwillsparks.com, and you can discover some more about the assessment and some things that we'll talk about in a moment. But I'm sure you're discovering that as we now have four generations in the workplace, that Gen Z that's entering,
Mhm.
they're not going to tolerate a whole lot of what we're calling here dependent
Yeah.
type of culture, are they?
Yeah, it is. This is causing much more than just a ripple effect across corporate America now with the four generations that are coming together and trying to mesh. And so there's a challenge there, but it's interesting. This is getting at a sort of a primal existential human I mean, it really gets at this sort of, this emotional underlying dynamic. And the challenge with the dependent group is that irrespective of your generation, the degree to which you want to be a part of that group and you want to get your stock award and you want to get your payout bonus and you want to be promoted and you want, and so to whatever degree those factors really around affiliation with the broader group exist, it sort of can override some of those generational differences. We're getting at a primal emotional need to
Okay.
be a part of something larger than ourselves. And so what we found is that the more independent or the what I would call the more actualized an individual is, irrespective of their age or generation, the more they're going to push back against this dependency cycle because in order to be successful, you have to actually regress psychologically. You have to stop asking questions. To a certain degree, you have to stop thinking. You just take orders, you salute, you put your head down,
Mm.
and the more self-actualized an individual is, the less likely they're going to do that. So they're there to be independent, to be creative, to solve problems, and to move forward. And so I found that it's that personality of a person driven out of a need for self-actualization that they're the ones that are going to buck up against that system. Now, you could make an argument that there's a higher percentage of those in a certain generation compared to others, and that may be
Yeah.
the case. I don't have any data in that regard, but that is but underlying that though are those sort of primal emotional needs to fit in and to be a part of something larger than ourselves, and it has tremendous benefit with synergy.
Yes.
But if we're not careful, we slip into that shadow side where we stop asking good questions and thinking independently.
Yeah. And innovation and creativity
Yeah,
drop and engagement drops, except around that task orientation.
that's
I
exactly
really
right.
like that.
Because what's rewarded is compliance. So
Yes.
compliance is what is either subtly or explicitly rewarded in a dependent culture, and that is at the opposite end of creativity. So, that
Mm.
those two, there's a tension there. And if you move too far in the dependent, then you're going to be rewarding compliance. And then those are the very leaders who slam their fist on the table and say, wait a minute, what happened to all the, I need people to think and bring me ideas and solve problems. What happened to the
Yeah.
team? And my answer is often, you happened to the team. That's what happened.
Yeah, that's when you hold up the mirror, right, Dr.
Right,
Williams?
right.
This person happened
Yes,
right
exactly
here.
right. Yeah.
Wow, which is that stark reality and that
Yes,
contrast with what I desire to be my outcomes and then what my inputs are in terms of getting to those outcomes. Well, I love what
exactly.
you're talking about there, and you're one of my first guests. This is our third season, but you're one of my first guests to talk about how it's really cross-generational then in terms of, because I mean I'm a kid of the 60s, product of the 70s. We didn't trust anybody over 30, so we were
Yeah.
constantly pushing back against whatever
Mhm.
sources of authority we had and seeking to level the playing field in a different direction. And I see many of those same qualities with Gen Z today with saying, okay, I need a coach, I need a therapist, the kinds of
Mhm.
lifestyle quality issues. So I'm intrigued that that stream of consciousness, if you will, from a Jungian perspective, transcends all the generations. And so you're looking more at a psychosocial development as opposed to just strictly in those generational silos. That's absolutely fascinating.
Yeah.
So let's talk for a second about unlocking the culture code around optimal performance, because what you've just said is innovation and creativity suffer when you're a keep your head down, be compliant, and compliance is your number one metric. Tell
Mhm.
us about optimal performance. How do we transform our leadership in order to bring optimal performance from a team?
Well, you actually just hit the nail on the head. You have to transform the leader and the team together, actually. So I've gotten at a place in my career where I really won't take on assignments that are somewhere around the, hey, go fix them or go do a 1 day retreat or go do an on-site and
Fire
bring them
hose them,
back.
right?
Yeah, because my view, this is just my personal view, but I think it's evidence-based, is that you can't have meaningful team development unless it's in concert with the development of the leader of the team. And
Yes.
so it's a
Mhm.
very sort of symbiotic dynamic that has to occur, and there has to be some synergies involved there. And so again, my personal view is that, let's use dependency. It's a great example. If you've
Mhm.
got a pro-dependent leader, I call those asserters. They're driven by a high need for power and control, and they have a lot of great qualities. They're decisive, they're candid, they're courageous, they're strategic, but then they have the shadow counterparts of all of those as well. And so they can
Mhm.
be arrogant, controlling, impatient, condescending, and they lead with fear. And so Machiavelli said, hey, it's better to be feared than loved, but this, when it gets into that extreme level,
Yeah.
then you are rewarding that. So the first thing I would say is that you have to focus on individual and leader development in sort of concert with the development of the team. Because I
Mhm.
used to have a belief, the way I would rationalize a retreat that I didn't think was really going to have any lasting impact was, I thought, well, it's not going to do any harm. Now
Mm.
I've actually changed my view on that. I've actually
Ah,
come to my view is that it does do harm, because people come in and they give you their hearts and their minds, and they fully engage in the team building process, and they want to believe, and then the leader doesn't change and things, they don't go back to business as usual. I think they actually regress and they can become worse because
Mm,
of resentment and the disappointment, or even heartbreak that comes out of that sort of, we're going
wow.
to espouse this, but we're actually going to reward the exact opposite. So to
Mm,
your point, it has to be in concert with the leader and the individual development piece first. And then the profile that I have, it's called the actualized team profile. And if your audience is interested, they can actually go to ATP for Actualized Team Profile, ATP free. It's all one word, atpfree.com. It's a very short 10 word pairs, and they will get their style and then the impact they have on a team at their best and at their worst. And that's the Jungian influence here because
hmm.
Jung said, hey, we're not either or, we're both and. And if you,
Yes.
so we are at our best, we're this, and at our worst, we're that,
Right,
both
right.
and approach. So the code is really looking at, in my framework, what percentage of the scale scores do you want to have in order to have your highest level of engagement and your optimal level of performance and whatever that may be, whether it's a certain amount of production or, whatever, again, whatever the context may be. And so we found that when you've got a secondary culture of dependency, in my model, it's at a 40% or less, and then you have a dynamic scale that's above 75, that's the optimal range. But when you go beyond 40 with dependency or beyond 20 with detached, which is the fight, flight, and group level, the dramatic is 30 or below. If you get beyond 30, then you're probably playing nice with each other, but maybe some politeness is trumping some candor. And so there typically is a performance issue that needs to be discussed in a dramatic culture, and we're ignoring the problem. There's a white elephant, an obvious problem in the room, but we're choosing not to talk about it. And that's the trip to Abilene. So those you kind of see that come out in the dramatic culture. So I've actually identified the scale and the scores where you want to be. And when you put the four scales together and you line up and you're in those optimal ranges, you not only are you at your highest levels of engagement with members of the team, but typically your creativity, your problem solving, and your overall performance, you've optimized those levers as well.
Yeah, okay. So you're tripping some of my Jungian qualities here, and I want to talk about the MBTI and the four continua and
Yeah,
things like
yeah,
that
yeah,
now, but
for
I
sure.
will avoid that. um, so that website, by the way, that Dr. Wheel just dropped is in the show notes, so be sure to go down there and take your team over there and go work on that. I absolutely love what you say, and I find myself at that same place in my career. I just simply refuse or I politely decline opportunities to go in and fire hose.
Mhm.
Human behavior is not going to change that quickly. A team's not going to transform. More to the point, a leader and a team will not transform and do what they need to do. It's got to be dripped over a period of time. The self-awareness has got to raise and things like that. So let's say that I'm in that place for optimal performance, Dr. Will, and my team, we've hit that mark and we're there. So now we're ready because we're succeeding, right? And we're hitting our metrics and things are growing. We need to add some people to the team.
Mhm.
In Work Positive Nation, we're all about attracting top talent, which
Mhm.
means that first we have ourselves an unlocked culture code and we're at optimal performance. So then we very much believe we attract persons to our team. How do we have conversations with people for whom the kind of assessments and nomenclature that you're talking about is nouveau? How do we have conversations with them about what we're doing to build and attract top talent?
Yeah. Well, in my case, it's fairly prescriptive. I have a leadership assessment that measures the style of a leader, and whether their degree of self-actualization. And so the achiever style, based on the need for achievement, has a lot of good qualities, but under stress, they micromanage and they can be fairly rigid and pessimistic. And so if you assess someone and you know they're a shadow achiever, then that's going to have a pretty negative impact on the team. An affirmer is the affiliation driven, relationship driven, warm, friendly, all about the team, individual. And so they bring a lot of positivity to the team. But if they're low in self actualization, what they may be lacking is candor, objectivity, objective discernment. They may be lacking crucial conversations. They may avoid conflict. And so you have to gauge that as well. And then the asserter, which, as I mentioned earlier, the high need for power, again, decisive, strategic, all of those sort of things. You have to assess their degree of self-actualization. So when you begin to add members to the team, you're going to obviously have an impact on the culture. I've researched, well, what exactly is culture? And in my definition, it's the dynamic interplay between the conscious and the shadow elements focus, the conscious is the task and the shadow elements around like, why are we doing this and how are we working together?
Mm.
So that, you've got that element of culture, and the three things that impact it are the individual styles of the members. We're talking about that. The second is the broader context. So the overall organizational culture will have an impact on the team culture as well as their environment. Are they expanding or contracting? And so in the example you're giving, we're expanding because we're adding new members. So that has a positive impact. But the most important element is the style and the shadow of the leader. And so as long as the leader has grown in his or her journey and their self-actualization, and they are irrespective whether they're an achiever, an affirmer, or an asserter, if they're reigning in their shadow and they're allowing the team to flourish, that's the most important element that's going to impact culture. So adding new members with a leader that is more self-actualized typically is going to be fine, because the style of the leader, where I can see it go sideways is when that individual's done such a great job leading that team. Well, guess what? They get tapped on the shoulder and they're elevated and promoted, and in comes another leader who maybe hasn't gone as far on his or her journey in self-awareness and self-actualization, and their shadow is imposed on that team, and you can see something's got to give. It's either the leader or the team, and frankly, it's usually the team culture that's going to shrink to meet the ego.
Yeah, they do, and the team gets shuffled around, right?
Yeah,
To
so
reflect
much today. So
yeah,
much. It's like professional sports. It's hard to don't fall in love with the team, because and now portal and college football. It's
crazy.
just a business, and so it's when you've got something special, hold on to it. I think that's what I tell a lot of my clients. When you're in that dynamic level and things are hitting on all cylinders, just know it won't last forever, and really take every moment to appreciate it and be grateful for it, and to try to, optimize it, because things change, and, so many things are out of our control that you see a lot of that sort of. My former, the late Peter Vale, who was a professor at GW, when I was there, published several books. He had a concept called permanent white water. Now, this was back 30 years ago. He was talking about there is no more refreezing. It's going to be permanent whitewater. Well, that's exponentially the case now. And so I think that if you've got that lightning in a bottle, if you're either a part of a team or you're leading a team where you're hitting on all cylinders, appreciate it, because, things change.
Oh, they do, and M&As are rampant today. So, we just never know who's going to own us this week, right?
That's right. Private equity comes in and few people cash out. And then the other folks
Right.
left are, typically greater pressure for cutting expenses and all of that.
Right. Yeah.
It
Check
can
the
be
side of the
challenging.
building for the nameplate, right?
That's
Make sure you
exactly
know where
right.
you work
Yeah.
this week. But to your point, I think that's a great retention of top talent.
Yeah, for sure.
Point is to make sure, if you're promoting someone, let's say a self-actualized, self-aware leader,
Mhm.
has led a team to optimal performance, then as you're talking about, we tend to say, okay, well, you did great there, come on up to here. So how do we manage that transition of the next leadership in such a way to as not destroy the optimal performance of that team?
Well, and my approach has been to assess the team culture, and then to assess the style of the new leader, so that they can see coming into it, hey, here it is, literally, and not just in black and white, it's in purple and red and green and blue. Here are the scores. You see that this team has an optimal culture, so don't break it. And then if they take the leadership assessment, the actualized leader profile, they get a sense of their degree of self-actualization, and maybe some immediate coaching around, hey, be mindful that you don't micromanage, or, that you don't, don't be formal. I see a lot of asserters that always want to sit at the head of the table, and they've got their hair, kind of that vampire slick back, and they've got the French cuffs, and they take themselves very seriously, and no one can challenge them. And you
Uh-huh.
can feel the life coming out of that team when that kind of
Yeah.
person that's more autocratic steps in, and it's, my way or the highway. And the problem with that is that the top talent and those that are the most self-actualized will eject from that. They
Yeah.
will
Yeah.
not stay in that toxic environment. And the
Right.
ones who stay in that environment it usually goes even darker. So they're willing to sacrifice their creativity or even their independent thinking in order to, get along with the new leader. And so that typically does not work out well. It's just not sustainable. So
Right.
not only do you have that impact on the culture, but your top performers on the team will very often move to another team, follow the leader, or just eject to another company if they're not in an environment where they can't show up and be their, authentic selves. And I'm not saying question everything and always push back. I'm just saying if they're
Right.
not allowed the freedom to
Yeah.
think independently and to solve problems with creativity.
Yeah, it's not that you always want to push back. It's just you want the latitude to be able to do that. And so they do, top talent does self-select when there's a different leadership style brought in, the team dynamics change completely. What I
Mhm.
hear you saying then is if I'm sitting looking at a place of promotion, make sure that I match my leader with my team rather than just bring in a leader we think will work or hope will work or pray will work and then expect the team to adjust to the leader.
That's exactly right. I mean, it's an art and a science for sure, but
Mm.
most organizations is just an art. It's like, well, we'll just put it together and we'll see what happens. And
Oh
there
yeah.
actually is a way to assess the style of the leader and understand the intensity of his or her shadow and the degree of self-actualization. So you can have a pretty good sense of, is this going to be a good fit? So I can tell you the exact opposite case where I've seen it's been a bad fit if you have a very dependent group that was working under a highly autocratic leader and
Right.
that person is leaves for whatever reason. If you bring in someone who's extremely self-actualized and very hands-off and always big picture and all of that, well, that team is frozen in that dependent state. There's a gap then. There's
They're floundering.
not an overlay, it's a gap. And so,
Yeah.
you do need to think about matching the leader with the culture of the team and sort of bringing everyone along together. So you can do it. You can do the assessments. You can understand sort of what you're getting into and make some more intentional decisions about who would be more successful in this versus someone else. But I think underlying all of that is you want a leader that is intellectually curious and willing to be vulnerable and willing to say, hey, I want to learn and grow in this position, and not someone who's as someone who does a fair amount of coaching, from time to time, I have clients that are very well defended. They are not putting their guard down. Their only flaw is they love too much or they work too hard. They're not willing to. They're just well defended, so they're not going to put their guard down. And a person like that, it makes it very challenging because of their ego. They're not able to get out of their own way, and that can create, really havoc, especially for a team that at once
Yeah.
was high performing.
Exactly. More of a fixed mindset as opposed to a growth mindset is what
Exactly.
you're describing there.
That's
Yeah.
the right way to, that's perfect. Yes.
Yeah, Dr. Will Sparks is my guest on this episode of the Work Positive Podcast. Go to drwillsparks.com right now, unless you're on the Peloton or walking a dog or something. Be careful if you are. and we appreciate you listening while you're doing other things. But just as soon as you can, it's in the show notes. Go to drwillsparks.com. We'll talk in a minute more about what you're going to find there. We've referred a lot, and because you and I both come from that same cornfield of Jungian psychology, right? We understand what the shadow that you keep referring to means. Can you give us a brief primer on understanding our own leadership journeys as well as the team journey towards recognizing that shadow side of who we are and how to really optimize our own performance as well as team performance by recognizing the shadow side and then playing more to our light?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll try to do it, sort of quickly, but essentially a Jungian perspective or Freudian is a psychodynamic perspective. And a psychodynamic perspective simply means there's an appreciation, there's an awareness of and an appreciation for the role of the subconscious or the unconscious or the shadow, whatever someone calls it, which is that sort of that emotional, irrational side that's embedded in our psyche that gets activated under stress. So for an individual, I call that their leadership shadow. Jung would call it your personal shadow. Freud would call it your id. It's essentially this immediate gratification, insecure, irrational part that we do our best to hide or to manage, until we let our guard down if we've had our second beer or we're tired at the end of the week or whatever,
Well, yeah,
so
we get
it comes
stressed
out to
out,
play.
and the
Yeah,
2-year-old Dr. Joey starts coming
that's
out.
exactly right. We get triggered and here it comes. And so
Yep.
that but Jung was very clear that the way to manage that is not to deny it.
Right.
It's not to say, well, wait, that's not me. I'm this other person. And Jung would say, well, you are that other person some of the time, but you also
Yep.
have this other side. And so what I see often are people that are unwilling to acknowledge it. So they deny it, they ignore it,
Mhm.
they repress it, or they project it on other people, and that feeds it. So that actually ends up having the opposite impact that you want, which is
Mm.
it gives it more power over you. So the first step is to have an awareness that there's no judgment. If you are a
Thank
human
you.
being, then you're going to have this shadow side. And so
Hmm.
if a person can recognize it without any judgment, and then the step to integrate it is to sort of walk with it. And again, Jung was very clear. You don't want to shine a light on it and try to wrestle it down to the ground and eradicate it.
Can you
That
even wrestle it down to the
you
ground?
couldn't, but he said even if you could, you wouldn't want to because that's
Yeah.
where creativity comes from.
Mm.
That's where, the persistence and the grit that we sometimes need that's fueled by emotion. It's completely irrational for me to start this business after I failed in my first 20 attempts, but it's that 21st business that hits and I have my IPO and I live
That's right.
happily ever after. That's the grit and persistence that comes from the shadow element. It's recognizing it and then beginning to take steps to integrate it. Well, the same model holds for a team. Just like an
Yeah.
individual, the collective has that shadow, and they're the three corresponding team shadows: detached, dramatic, and dependent. My
Mm.
research has aligned them, shown the correlation between the style, the achiever. The irony is that
Mm.
the achiever creates the detached culture, which is the lowest performing. The
Yeah.
affirmer creates a dramatic, and then the asserter creates dependent. So when we realize the impact that we're having on others, and
Mm.
just at some level that there's an emotional dynamic at play in any sort of a team or group setting, and you don't have to be a psychologist. A savvy manager just realizes there's some pent up emotion that we need to vent or that needs to be expressed, or there's some fear about the uncertainty or the ambiguity that we're facing
Mm.
going into Q1 of 25, whatever that may be.
Mm.
Just allowing the folks to vent that and get it off their chest is a huge step in sort of getting it past the group so that they can move forward. And managers that are uncomfortable because they can't control the narrative or they're not sure what might be said, or they're just not comfortable talking about the emotional piece,
Mm.
they actually make it worse because it just builds and builds and builds until it
Yes.
erupts.
And the cap is too tight and it's going to blow
Exactly.
off
That's it.
at some point. You're
Yep.
reminding me of a couple of conversations I've had on this podcast with Joshua Friedman from 6seconds.org. And he talks about those 6 seconds that, those emotional impacts that we have on others.
Yeah.
I love the fact that you're giving us something tangible. We as leaders, managers, can become aware of our impact on others and begin to see how we affect others intentionally or unintentionally. It doesn't matter,
Right.
right? And so we're driving the optimal performance on the team. Wow. Thanks so much for that. I've
Yep.
mentioned drwillsparks.com a couple of times. Tell Work Positive Nation what we're going to find when we go there.
There are a number of resources there. First, there is my TED Talk. So in 2018, I published, I guess would be the right verb, The Power of Self-Awareness. And as I said, it's essentially a tribute to the late, great Dr. Jerry Harvey, author of The Abilene Paradox, where he held up a mirror during my first semester with him when I was on the tail end of a divorce. And in my paper, I asked what happened to my marriage. And he said, "You
Wow.
happened to your marriage, son." And if you want to,
Whoa, that got uncomfortable
if
real
you
fast.
it did, and if you want to do the rest of the world a great big favor, you'll prevent that from happening going forward. And so he gave me some
Oh,
very
wow.
candid feedback, and but it was life changing. It
Mm.
literally changed the trajectory of my life, professionally and personally. And so
Oh,
I
wow.
recount that in the TED Talk. There's also a lot of blog articles. There are links to buy my books as well there. And then there's some links there's some free assessments both that individuals and teams can take as well.
Sweet.
Um, we have a certification program coming up in June here at
Mm.
Queen's University in Charlotte, North Carolina. There's
Mm.
early bird discount for that going on right now. So a lot of
Nice.
information about the sort of the psychodynamic or Jungian approach
Mhm.
to leader development, team development, and executive coaching.
In Work Positive Nation, we're always looking for great certifications, and so is that an online certification that we can do?
You can start it online. The
Okay.
June program is a 3-day that's in person.
Oh, just
It,
three
it
days. Okay.
provides It provides 21 credit hours continuing ed credit with SHRM, 21 hours with ICF, International Coach Federation,
Yeah, sure.
and HRCI credit as well. So
Nice.
it's certified by those organizations and provides, you're getting certified in this sort of Jungian suite of assessments, but it also has a practical advantage of the continuing ed credit as well.
Oh, I love it. Well, here in Work Positive Nation, we're ICF and SHRM compliant and
Yeah,
certification providers. So
yeah,
absolutely love all that. The link to your TED Talk, we're going to add that in the show notes also, if that's okay, so that
sure.
we've got easy access to go there. The link to Actualized Teamwork, which is going to be a great way of getting in touch with so much of what we talked about in this podcast today, as
Yeah,
well as more. So, Dr. Will Sparks, Work Positive Nation always wants to know from my guest one thing. So, Dr. Will Sparks, what's your one thing you would suggest Work Positive Nation to start doing today to create the kind of positive work culture that we've been talking about?
I think the realization that as I say in the book, that culture isn't just something that happens to you, you happen to it. And so I think that we tend to think of the organization as something that's out there or something that happens to me. And so I'm a big believer in the individual accountability and individual responsibility. What difference can I make in whatever sphere of influence I have? And you might be the CEO, you might be the CHRO, you may be an individual contributor or anything in between. And so it's realizing that all I can control is the way that I show up, the way that I respond or overreact or whatever the context may be. So that's mine is to really take an honest assessment of what's driving me, where am I in my shadow? What impact am I having on others? Having that honest conversation with ourselves and making a commitment to showing up in a different way. And then maybe the most important element of that is to give ourselves some grace when we have a bad day, because you can be committed to development and be committed to personal growth. And we're all going to have those Friday afternoons where we thought we were going to get off early and here we are at 6 o'clock or, whatever. And so, or the one person that always manages to push our buttons. And so we're going to take a step back or a step sideways. And so give ourselves some grace when that happens and recommit to being the very best version of ourselves that we can be. Jung was very clear. He said, it's better to be whole than perfect. And so I think what he meant by that was understanding that we have that shadow element, making peace with it, giving other people permission to call it out when they see it, and starting that integration piece, because it's when we're truly whole and authentic, I think, that we can best serve ourselves and our organizations.
Well, as a recovering perfectionist, I can say a hearty amen to being whole as opposed to a perfectionist. Dr. Will, this has been such a great conversation. I'd love to have you back on sometime on our
I'd love
podcast.
to.
We could learn
Anytime.
some
I'd love
more.
to.
All right. Thank you so much. I'm better for this conversation, and I know Work Positive Nation is too. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Work Positive Podcast. Please share this podcast with your friends who are HR and small business leaders so they can do one thing today to create a positive work culture that increases productivity and profits. I'd like to give you a free Work Positive course just for listening. It's called Something to Talk About, and it's transformed the work conversations of so many people all over the world. Get your free copy when you go to workpositive.today/something to talk about, and you can start transforming your conversations today. Remember, it pays to work positive.